The way we are interacting with the world and experiencing every moment of our lives is shaping our reality. And every one of us have our own reality, our own world that revolves around the way we look at it, interact with it, and experience it. So what we see is what exists. Every moment of our lives, our perceptions are creating our realities by directing our thoughts, our emotions, our behaviors, actions, decisions, and choices. And that is exactly how we are discovering the world and creating our own realities. And while discovering the world and experiencing life in its own right, we, in our minds, are constantly directing the events happening and narrating ourselves a story about what's happening in the story, much like a narrator in a book explains what's happening in the plot. We all do it. We engage ourselves in an internal monologue or self-talk very often about the events that's happening in our lives, what it means, what it makes us think about, and what we should do. And when we experience life in a favorable light, the monologue can be extremely encouraging, supportive, affirming, and create a reality full of opportunities and endless possibilities. While the self-talk can be distressing when life takes a downhill and we feed our mind with unrealistic, inaccurate explanation of what's going on in our lives. By limiting our ability to believe in ourselves, our own abilities, and to reach our utmost potential. This unrealistic, inaccurate explanation lead to unnecessary negative emotions, mood, and diminishes our ability to make positive changes in our life, lowering our confidence in ourselves to do so. A lot of mental and emotional sufferings come from the way we talk to ourselves in our mind. And more habitually, we engage ourselves into it, sooner these mental habits often take the form of standard ways of talking to ourselves, which leaves us being anxious, stressed, depressed, demotivated, inconfident, messed, and miserable. A better way to take charge of this mental habit that interfere with our healthy functioning and make our life miserable is by starting to tell ourselves a different story. By observing, identifying, and labeling the faulty thought, let's identify and label different faulty thought patterns. All or none thinking, the tendency to look at things from absolute black and white categories. Mental filtering, a thought pattern that filters out all the positive and focus only on the negative. When something good happens, you ignore it, pass it off, or turn it into something negative. Overgeneralization, the tendency to draw wide conclusions from a single isolated negative event and assuming them to be a never-ending pattern. Jumping into conclusions, a tendency to automatically assume negative reactions or outcomes even when there is no evidence to support the conclusion. Catastrophizing, the tendency to make mountains out of molehills by exaggerating the importance of negative experiences, failure, or shortcomings. Personalization, the tendency to see oneself as the cause of negative events and outcomes, in fact, primarily holding self as responsible for all the misfortunes. Emotional reasoning, a thinking pattern in which you think your negative emotions and feelings reflect your reality, assuming that just because you feel a certain way, then it must be true. Should and shouldn't statements. Your thinking functions on a set of rules that you and everyone else should follow based on your own version of reality. When you don't follow these rules, you feel guilty. And when others fail to follow these rules, you feel hurtful and resentment. Labeling and mislabeling. The tendency to use absolute negative labels to describe others and especially oneself. Self-serving biases. A tendency to attribute one's own success to internal factors while putting the blame for failure on external factors. Ways to challenge faulty thinking pattern. Journaling, writing down the negative thoughts. Identifying and labeling the faulty thoughts. Challenging the assumptions by asking questions. Challenging and evaluating the trueness of the thought. Evaluating the thought by putting forward supportive evidence. Visualizing the possible worst scenario in mind. Redefining the labels and reframing our thoughts. Also, attributing the external factors as a cause. Countering negative thought by an alternative positive thought.